Hello, awesome fifth graders. I'm so excited to be back and reading The Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt with you again today. We are so close to finishing, but unfortunately, this will not be the last read aloud of The Wednesday Wars. There will be one more finale. Okay. So once again, I am allowed to be reading this to you on YouTube thanks to Scholastic Books and their permission for teachers to keep reading to kids, and I'm so grateful for that. When we left off at the beginning of this past week, we learned that Holling's backpack ended up ripping and he lost all the utensils except for one wooden spoon, which makes eating chili pretty hard. We also learned that there are poisonous snakes where they are camping, and so Holling, Meryl Lee, Doug Switek, Danny, and Mrs. Baker, and my Thee were all having a very hard time sleeping the first night. So they were sitting up around the fire, and what did it start to do? But pour rain on top of them. And were the kids sleeping in tents? Nope. They were sleeping on the ground in sleeping bags. And that is where we left off. So let's see what happens next. All right. We probably would have stayed there all night if it hadn't started to rain. Actually, started isn't really the right word. It didn't come on like rain usually does, a little at a time until first you realize that you're feeling a drop or two, and then you realize it's more than a drop or two, and then you know you need to get someplace because it's going to really come down in a minute. Here, 1 second, it was all ascending sparks from the fire, and the next, it was all rain. It must have been something like the moment the doors closed on Noah's Ark. We threw our wool blankets over our heads, but it was already too late. We held the blankets tight around us as a cold wind dropped down with the rain, and while every single 7th grader from Mrs. Baker's class was hollering and trying to keep already soggy sleeping bags from getting a whole lot soggier and asking if snakes came out in the rain, Danny and I loaded more wood onto the fire to keep it from going out. And that's pretty much what we all did for the rest of the night. Hollered and wrung out our sleeping bags and kept throwing wood on the fire, except for Mrs. Baker, who went inside the tent with Mrs. Sidman. When dawn finally came, which we were all ready for, let me tell you, every bit of ground around the campsite was wet. Every single bit. Puddles were everywhere. It squelched while we walked, though sometimes it was hard to tell. Sometimes it might have been our sneakers doing the squelching. Mrs. Baker came out of the tent and looked at us with half-closed eyes. "Awfully soggy, isn't it?" she said. "Why is it that when teachers go on campouts, they get to have tents?" Mrs. Sidman came out with a dark green poncho that covered her head and reached all the way down to her ankles. She looked around at the miserable campsite. We all had mud up to our knees, and most of us had draped our sleeping bags on the pine branches above us, and water dripped down from their corners. "You all look like a bunch of refugees," she said. "Perhaps we should move towards breakfast," said Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Sidman nodded. "You used a lot of wood last night," she told us. "I'll find the eggs," said Mrs. Baker. That morning, we had scrambled eggs spiced with pine bark, which came from the sticks we used to stir them with. The orange Kool-Aid we drank was muddy because the rain had stirred up the river before we had filled our jugs. The bread was soggy, so we dripped honey onto the slices and rolled them up so they didn't taste too bad. Mrs. Sidman warmed the rest of the chili over the fire again, in case anyone wanted it. Only Doug Switek did, which was a mistake, as it turns out. I think if it had kept on raining, we would have all gotten in under Mrs. Sidman's poncho and walked back home. But after Meryl Lee and I had carried all the pots to the stream, we waded right on in with them, since we were already wet all the way to the bone. The clouds started to shred, and the sunbeams slit through. Each beam stabbed at the cold winds until one by one they whimpered and died. The whole sky grew yellow, and we threw off the wet blankets. Nothing smells worse than a wet woolen blanket, and then squelched around the campsite gathering more wood for the day, until suddenly it was so warm that someone said, "Let's go swimming." and we all ran a little way down the paths to the latrines and put on shorts and came back to the water and stepped carefully in. It was still cold until Danny finally let himself slide down with the high current and over the waterfall ledge straight into the pool. When he surfaced, he was laughing and snorting with water up his nose. "It's great," he said. And so we all went over the waterfall and got water up our noses. Even Merrill Lee. Even my feet holding Merrill Lee's hand. That's what we did for most of the morning, while Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Sidman stood above us and watched. I could tell that Mrs. Baker was wanting to try it. It was probably getting hot on the open rocks above the falls, with the sun coming straight down now. Everything in the woods around us was steaming and glistening. The ferns, the pines, the leaves, the moss, everything. Even the teachers. It got to be hard to be a teacher all the time and not jump into a pool of clear water and come up laughing and snorting with water up your nose. We ate lunch, chicken salad sandwiches and cucumber spears, which we didn't need any utensils for. And then we headed back to the water, where Danny was throwing dives that the rest of us tried to match but couldn't. He could flip 1.5 times and land head first right where the falls hit the pool, disappearing in the white spray. Once he got around 2 full turns, which no human being should be able to do, and came up laughing and snorting so hard he could barely breathe. That's all we did most of the afternoon, too. Not a diagrammed sentence in sight. Swimming and diving in a waterfall through the heated hours of the day, until finally we came back up to the campsite and Mrs. Baker assigned us our chores. Now, you have to understand that we'd been here for a day and a half, and in all that time, Doug Switek hadn't followed the gentleman's sign and used what was over the 2 ridges. It was pretty clear that he needed to. Actually, it was very clear that he wanted to. But he wasn't going to use a hole in the middle of the woods, he said, even if he had dug it himself. Still, when you've eaten chili the night before and chili for breakfast, you can't hold it off forever. Even Doug Switek knew that, and that's why he finally gave in. He didn't have a choice. He was gone for a long time. No one said anything, but everyone watched down the path. And no one was surprised when he came back smiling, which you can probably understand for yourself. He probably had no idea what had found him and was now following him. Even we couldn't tell. "It looks like smoke," said Mythie. "But it's following him," said Danny. Mrs. Baker sighed. "It's not smoke," she said. "It's mosquitoes," I said. Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes. We all ran. Doug Switek couldn't figure out why until the first ones landed on him. He looked down and saw his arms covered. That was until they flew into his eyes. Then he ran too, and probably hit a whole lot more trees than he would have if the world was a fairer place. The mosquitoes followed us like little airplanes. You could hear them buzzing around. We ran down to the water and splashed at them. They hovered above us and laughed. We ran towards the woods and swatted at them with pine branches. They laughed some more. Then we ran towards the fire, since Mrs. Baker said they hated the smoke. They don't. Hiding in the smoke helps about as much as scrunching under a desk during an atomic bomb attack. "Keep moving and stay in groups," said Mrs. Baker, which is the same strategy to use if you're floating in the ocean and surrounded by sharks. It means that anyone on the outside of the group gets picked off. So we took turns getting in close to the center, except I gave Merrill Lee my turn since she had helped me with the pots. She said that I saved her about a pint of blood, which was worth it with the way that she had smiled at me when she said this. And that's how Mrs. Biggio found us when she hiked in at dusk, all huddled in small groups, swatting hopelessly at the hordes of mosquitoes nothing cooking on the fire. Mrs. Sidman was in the tent, with the entrance zipped up. Mrs. Baguio unslung her backpack, whipped out a can of insect repellent, and went to work on us. Then she loaded wood onto the fire and sent half of us out for more. The rest of you, bring me 3 large flat stones from the river and scrub them clean. And bring back 2 pots of water, too. Who's been cleaning these? When we came back with the stones and pots of water, she unloaded garlic and carrots and potatoes and turnips and chuck beef and tomatoes. My fee stared at it all. "Fit beaucoup?" she asked. "It will be by the time we're done," said Mrs. Baguio. "The curry and the ginger root are in the front pocket there. I couldn't find any lemongrass, so we'll have to make do." She and my fee made do. In a little while the water was boiling, and they had chopped up the potatoes and turnips into one pot and the chuck beef into another. And then they combined them and added everything else that Mrs. Baguio had brought. And even if there wasn't any lemongrass, it all smelled as wonderful as any food cooked over an open fire can smell, which is pretty wonderful, let me tell you. Just as we saw the first star, Mrs. Baguio and my fee ladled the stew out into bowls that Mrs. Baguio had packed and gave us spoons that Mrs. Baguio had packed and picked up all along the trail. "You can never be too careful about your supplies," she said to Mrs. Sidman, who, because she was eating hot fit beaucoup, was happy enough to not blame me for anything, even though I still was the one who carried the pots down to the stream to clean them out, with Merrill Lee. And neither of us minded at all. We were still there when Mrs. Baguio and my fee came down to wash Mrs. Baguio's cutting knives, which she wouldn't let anyone but my fee touch. And when Mrs. Baguio said to my fee that she had meant to be up to the campsite earlier, but that she had taken the morning to speak to the Catholic Relief Agency that had sponsored my fee when she came to Vietnam, she wanted my fee to know that the house where she was living with the Relief Sisters was very nice. But if she wanted, that is, if my fee would like to, Mrs. Baguio had a small house, and she was living all alone now, and she thought that maybe, if my fee would ever consider it, could ever imagine it, that maybe my fee could move in too, until my fee put her arms up around Mrs. Baguio, and Mrs. Baguio put her arms around my fee, and the ripples of water replaced all the words. That night I lay awake. It seemed that the soggy ground had sunk down and left a whole lot of rocks to poke up into my back. I watched the bazillion stars amaze the sky above. I watched until they fell asleep themselves, half my mind on sea, half on shore, thinking about my fee and Mrs. Baguio, and Lieutenant Baker coming home to Mrs. Baker, and Danny Hupfer getting ready for his bar mitzvah, and Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., and how in 5 years I'd have to register for the Vietnam draft, and how the dew was starting to soak into my sleeping bag. So I was still awake when the dawn started to think about showing herself. The air was coloring everything gray, and the fog was coming up from the ground in white shreds and billows, as if the whole campsite had lifted itself up into the clouds overnight. I slipped out of my dewy sleeping bag and walked through the white and the gray to the water. When I reached it, the stream rippled happily, as if it had been waiting just for me all this time. I knelt down and lowered my palm into it. Cold, frigidly cold. But I rolled up my pants and I waded in. Beneath me, the rocks of the stream bed felt smooth and slick, even soft, as the water rushed past, carrying itself away. Then I looked upstream. The disk of the sun had just come up, and the billows of fog had bowed to it and backed away. The river was a sudden ribbon of silvery light, flickering and sparkling and flashing, carrying the new light on its back all the way down from the high mountains. It was so bright that you couldn't see below the surface until the water was right up to you. and then it was suddenly clear and buoying me up in its rush. And it never stopped. This rush of bright water from the mountains, these flashes and chunks of light from the sun, there was so much of it to come. I didn't tell anyone about the river that morning, not even Merrill Lee. I think that if I had told Pastor McKellen, he would have said it was a vision. I think if I had told Mrs. Baker, she would have said that it was a miracle, that all dawns were miracles. Miracles being much on her mind lately, as you can understand. I think that if I had told Shakespeare about the river, he would have said, all this amazement can I qualify. But he would have been wrong, since what I saw was something more beautiful than has ever been written. But I didn't tell anyone, not even Danny, who was hoping for a miracle right up to the day of his bar mitzvah. And that's where we're going to stop. All right, guys, we have one more read aloud left in the Wednesday Wars. We are just about finished with their camping trip, so we aren't going to end on Holling's camping trip with his class. So what do you think we're going to read about next? The last little paragraph was about Danny Hupfer. So I want you to be thinking about what do we know about Danny and what's coming up that's really important in Danny's life. I also want you to think about what Holling saw in the river and why it kind of just stuck with him so much. I want you to really try to visualize the description and maybe listen to it again and tell me why you think that was so shocking or awe-inspiring to Holling. All right, stay tuned for our last read aloud of the Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt.